All right, guys, this is Miss Howie. Welcome to American History 2. We're going to start off Unit 1, kind of where American 1 left off. So if you were in the fall semester, then you have definitely heard this stuff before. Actually, a lot of this unit about Reconstruction in the Gilded Age, you will have already heard. Now, that was a long time ago, so you're probably going to need a refresher on it, which is why we're doing it again in American 2. If you were in the spring, though, when we left school for COVID, there's a good chance that you probably didn't see this material because a lot of you just stopped doing anything, which, I get it. It was a really tough time, but that means that you definitely need to like perk up, listen up, because you need to know this stuff, especially if you did not get it in American One. Um, so, anyway, that being said, let's just go ahead and hop in. So, we're going to talk about some migration that Americans experienced moving westward during and after the Civil War. Um, Real quick note, we're going to hit on Reconstruction, which is the time period after the Civil War, a little bit more in this unit, but we're not going to go super in depth. So, if you don't remember a lot about Reconstruction or you never learned it in the first place, then I would go watch the Reconstruction notes that I've posted on Canvas that are directly from the American One class. Okay, so that being said, let's talk about westward migration during and after the Civil War. Okay, so war's expensive, right? If you've had me as a teacher before, you know I always say that. Even if you're doing great in a war costs money. And so to get some money to continue to fund the Civil War for the Union, right, for the United States, the government passed what was called the Homestead Act of 1862. Basically, the US government owned a whole bunch of this land here in the middle of the United States called the Great Plains, and they were having a really hard time selling it. The land's really not that great. It's kind of dusty out there. It's hard soil, unpredictable climate. It's a hard living. And so people, when they were moving west, they would go all the way to the West Coast. They wouldn't really stop in the middle. So the Homestead Act of 1862 basically said, hey, here's $10 for 160 acres to any U.S. citizen. And the only catch is that you have to work the land for 5 years. So at the end of 5 years, you have to prove that you have improved upon the land or basically made it useful in some way. And so this was a really easy way for a lot of people to move out west during this time to get 160 acres of land. Definitely part of the American dream in the 1800s, or probably since the beginning of the United States, or even before, like in colonial times, was this idea of land ownership, owning your own land and kind of like making that for yourself and earning a living. And so this was kind of the ticket for a lot of people to do that. It was geared more towards white Americans during this time. However, after the Civil War, there were a lot of black farmers from the South that left to escape Jim Crow laws and lynchings and things like that to go out west and to start a new life for themselves. Those black farmers were known as exodusters, the idea that they are moving from an area, leaving in an exodus to the Great Plains, which is dusty, so exodusters. But in general, people who took advantage of the Homestead Act were called homesteaders, and it was a really tough life. Um, Many people were unable to prove that they had, quote, improved upon the land in 5 years, and a lot of them had to give that land back to the federal government, and then the federal government would just sell that land over again to a new homesteader for another $10. But to try to make it so that farming eventually was successful in this area to make the middle part of the United States and any other kind of like difficult or challenging area in the U.S. profitable, the federal government passed a law called the Morrill Land Grant Act, which basically said that there were going to be certain colleges established around the country that would focus very specifically on research into agricultural techniques and mining techniques. And so over the span of probably the last, I don't know, what is it, like 150-ish, 170-ish years, there have been more of these laws passed where now every state in the country has at least one of these universities that originally was founded to really just be like a hub of research for agriculture and mining. In North Carolina, NC State was originally founded as the kind of the agricultural school, and we also have North Carolina A&T State University that was established in the 1980s as a subsequent type of this very similar law. And then another thing the government did to give land, in this case, we're going to talk about Native Americans too, because it's important to recognize that, natives are living in these areas. And for a lot of natives, this is not where they're actually from historically. They have been put there by the federal government decades before. And so now this land that is being sold to people, to homesteaders, or in this case with the Oklahoma land rush, literally given away for free, that was Native American land. And so they're going to be pushed off and they're going to be moved to some other places. So we're going to talk, I think, more tomorrow about kind of how this westward migration is still affecting Native Americans. But specifically in Oklahoma, remember, this was that place in the 1830s where the Indian Removal Act said that all Southeastern Native Americans had to move. So, okay, fast forward like 50 years, the federal government now wants to push natives off that land again. So the Oklahoma land rush in April 1889 basically allowed people to take this land for free. Like literally, you can kind of read the description here. Like at noon, they shot off a gun in the air and people lined up basically on a starting line. And when that gun went off, they just rode their horses off into the land and they would have a flag and they would just put the flag down on the plot of land that they claimed. So the idea, though, is that by the end of the 1800s, the entire American continent, East Coast to West Coast, including the middle, has been populated by white Americans. Again, there were some Black farmers. We are going to talk about immigrants too, and we are going to talk about Native Americans, but the idea of the American dream of land ownership spreading from coast to coast is essentially kind of complete at the end of the 1800s. Let's talk about what it's like to live as a Western farmer. So, remember, these people are called homesteaders. Typically, people who took advantage of the Homestead Act were not very wealthy to begin with. They were probably trying to escape impoverished conditions on the very crowded East Coast, or in the case of, let's say, like an exoduster, possibly escaping, racism and like in very real racial violence, life-threatening violence in the South. So for a lot of these homesteaders, they had, these dreams and these goals of making it big and selling lots of crops and making lots of money. But what really ended up happening is a lot of these farms were just really small. It was really hard to live out west because there was not a lot of lumber. So they lived in like literal dirt houses. These are called sod houses. There's a picture of it over here. Um, and like I said earlier, it's just a really hard life. And so at the end of 5 years, a lot of people couldn't really prove that they had made the land quote better. And so they left. They're struggling with being isolated. They're lonely. They're far from anyone and everyone. There's bugs, there's droughts, there's just unpredictable climates. There's competition from really similar farmers, quote, not want to say next door because they're not next door, but like in the farm closest to you, like they're selling the exact same crop and there's not a lot you can grow out there. It's like wheat and barley and like hops. That's it. And so there's just lots of competition with whatever you can grow. And then also there's been feuds with cowboys. So cowboys were trying to take this, herds of cattle from places like in Texas, it was called the Open Range, and then take them up to places like Chicago to be processed and then sent out as beef. And they got to move that cattle through farms essentially. And this was really pissing off farmers. And so they would set up their barbed wire fences, showing that they, are privatizing their property. No one can come on my land, but it was making it really difficult for farmers to move cattle. And then with the expansion of the railroads and then these barbed wire fences, cowboys just kind of fell out of existence because they weren't needed anymore around kind of like the 1880s. But like I said, again, I think like I said a lot of times, farming's really hard, physically, but also financially. And so a lot of these farmers, right, they weren't very wealthy to begin with. And so they might have $10 for land, but they don't have enough money to buy all the equipment and the seeds and everything like that that they need to make farming successful. So they would take out loans and they took out these loans from banks. And the banks kind of knew that they couldn't pay these loans back very well. But the farmers would grow their crops, but because there was so much competition, so much supply, let's say, that there was a fall in demand and a fall in prices, and they just never made enough money to pay it back. And so farmers are pretty pissed off at this point. They're blaming the bankers, like I said, who are issuing loans with really high interest rates where they can't really pay it back. Farmers are also pissed off at railroad owners who are increasing the cost of shipping their crops, across the country. And that was really the only way that farmers can make money is if their crops got to the consumer. But if they can't pay the price to ship the crop, then that's the problem. So we're going to kind of talk about more of these issues later on in this unit because it's going to form the basis of what's called the Populist Party a little bit later on. I kind of already mentioned this, but the growth of railroads was really important during this time. It's going to not only connect the East and the West Coast, but it's going to provide for more like commerce and industry and economy across our country. So if you look at this map over here, you can see that in the 1870s, there was already a ton of railroad connection going on up here in the north. There is some, definitely not as much, but some in the south. But over here in the west, it's like relatively untouched. And so the Transcontinental Railroad that's finished in 1869, this one little railroad here, it connects all of these East Coast railroads to the West Coast. Now, eventually, there's going to be a lot of other railroads that are built out there, but the Transcontinental Railroad is the very first one that truly connects East and West. And to get that road built, the federal government helped to pay for some of that construction. And then the actual people who built the railroad were oftentimes immigrants. The two most large immigrant groups that helped to build the railroad were the Irish and the Chinese. And we'll look a little bit more later on this unit at some discrimination that they faced. But then also Black Americans were employed to build this railroad. Civil War veterans. It was a really tough job and it was really low paying, but for a lot of people during this time, they were desperate for work. But we'll talk more about the railroad conditions, especially for the workers, a little bit later on in this unit. But when it's finished, you have quick travel from east to west, you have increased trade around the country, the birth of the mail order catalog, kind of like today's Amazon. Back then, you would get a magazine in the mail and you would literally order anything you wanted out of it and it would be shipped to you over the railroads. You didn't have to live near a big city. It would take a long time for it to get to you, but you didn't have to live near a big city to get, things that you wanted. And then you also had the growth of these smaller, what were called boom towns along the railroad, kind of what you think of like an old western town with like a saloon and stuff like that. Like those were real, and those were along the railroad. Okay, so what's the consequences? What are the consequences to this westward migration during and after the Civil War? Well, we're going to transition from this period of Civil War / Reconstruction. We're going to transition into a new period called the Gilded Age. This is the late 1800s, which is really what we're going to spend a lot of this unit talking about. The Gilded Age is a nickname for the late 1800s that was actually coined by Mark Twain, the American writer, during this time, where he said, "The golden gleam of the gilded surface hides the cheapness of the metal underneath." Basically saying this is a time period where on the surface, things look really awesome. It looks like they're covered in gold, right? That's gilded, it's covered in gold. But if you scratch that gold away just a little bit, or you look a little bit closer, you can see that it's really cheap and it's really dirty underneath. So on the surface, in the late 1800s, you have a time period of seemingly prosperity. We're going to look this unit at like growing businesses and things like that. Industrialization, factories are growing at a really high rate. There's new technologies, the light bulb, the telephone, harnessing electricity, all these things. Population growth with people, coming into our country, this huge spikes in immigration. Like things look really good on the surface. But underneath, it's really bad. Like there's rampant government corruption. There's a growing wealth gap where the rich are getting incredibly rich and the poor are getting very, 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 very poor. And then the poor are being mistreated. You also have other social groups that are incredibly mistreated, like immigrants and Black Americans. I mean, what they're experiencing with the Jim Crow South, and then just, in general, racial discrimination across the country. Women are falling behind in rights as well. So, on the surface, things look good, but underneath, it's actually pretty crappy. And so that's called the Gilded Age. Some other consequences of post war migration are going to be the loss of culture, land, and resources for Native Americans that we'll look at tomorrow, increased social and economic hardships for a variety of people, Black Americans, women, immigrants, farmers, laborers. We're going to talk about them all this unit and kind of what's going on with them and how they try to overcome some obstacles. We also have the growth of cities and urbanization, and a lot of these cities become very overcrowded and very impoverished. You have the spread of corrupt governments everywhere from the federal government being corrupt to very small, local governments and cities. We'll look at government corruption and then the rise of big businesses and banking, basically monopolies and trusts dominating the economy, making tons of money. You have like the first millionaires and billionaires during this time. But again, that does contribute to a growing wealth gap. So all of these things that we talked about today, it's a really good introduction into this unit of, things look good on the surface, but underneath there's a lot of like really crappy stuff going on. And like I said, we'll unpack that over the next few days. All right, so at this point, make sure that if you need to go back to anything in the notes, you can rewind, make sure that you can answer your closure and do all that good stuff based on what you heard today. And if you have any questions, please make sure that you ask me or your teacher. Okay, thanks.